My girlfriend Dana's car seemed to break down every 2 weeks, and right on cue, her old friend Thomas, the mechanic, was always the first one on the scene. Not just sometimes. Every single time. At first, I brushed it off as coincidence, but then the pattern got too neat. He'd show up like some sort of roadside superhero, ready to tow her car straight to his shop for another suspiciously free fix. And the part that ate at me most? No one but me seemed to question it. Eventually, though, I followed him, and that's when I got the proof. When coincidence turns into a schedule. It started with what looked like bad luck, but the timing was the thing that refused to sit right with me. Dana's car didn't break down randomly the way you'd expect, once after a long trip, or maybe during a cold snap in winter. No, hers failed with an eerie regularity, almost like it had an internal timer set to explode every 2 weeks. I watched it happen. The alternator one time, the brakes a couple weeks later, then the starter not long after that. Battery, transmission, back to brakes. It rotated through disasters like it had a checklist. What really got under my skin was that the schedule never drifted. 14 days. If the last breakdown hit on a Friday afternoon, the next would land right on another Friday, often within the same hour. I could actually predict her car's failures more accurately than I remembered my own deadlines. After the third time, I even started writing them on my phone calendar, half as a joke, half as a sanity check. Car fails again got penciled in every other week, and each reminder turned out to be dead on. Normal car trouble doesn't stick to a timetable. Things wear out, sure, but they do it messily and unpredictably. A starter dies after thousands of cranks. Brake pads fade over months of use. Batteries weaken slowly until one day they won't turn over the engine. But none of that happens in precision 2-week intervals. These breakdowns were behaving with more consistency than actual maintenance schedules. It felt less like a failing car and more like someone staging little shows on repeat. Dana, on the other hand, sighed as nothing more than inconvenience piled on bad fortune. She'd throw her hands up, complain about the headache of getting stranded again, and then move on with her day once Thomas swooped in to fix it. I'd sit there biting my tongue because luck doesn't punch a clock that reliably. Nobody gets an alternator failure exactly 14 days after a dead battery, followed 2 weeks later by brakes going soft again. That wasn't luck. It was rhythm. After a while, I stopped being surprised and started waiting it out like an exam scoring day. I'd wake up on one of those Fridays and feel my stomach sink. I didn't wonder if the car would fail. I wondered when. The call or text always came by late afternoon. The engine wouldn't turn over, or the brake pedal felt wrong, or the transmission had just quit mid-drive. I'd listen, nod, already knowing it was time again. Dana never clocked the precision. To her, it was just bad brakes hitting over and over, each one separate from the last. But to me, it was impossible to miss the metronome keeping time. 2 weeks, 2 weeks, 2 weeks. Nobody I told seemed to believe me either. Friends brushed it off as me overthinking, like I was stretching coincidences until they clicked into a pattern in my head. But if you could have seen the notes I kept with dates marked down like evidence, you'd understand why it felt more like proof than paranoia. The system we were living under made everything harder. Any plan Dana and I made had a 50% chance of collapsing into a repair day. Even when we still managed to meet up, her mind was often split between where we were and her car sitting in a garage again. It turned her car into an anchor, and not in the sense that it kept her grounded. It dragged us back every other week like a chain on her schedule. After enough cycles, I couldn't shake the thought, if randomness wasn't responsible, then someone else was. That question echoed louder with every entry in my notes. Who benefits from this exact rhythm? Who shows up every single time, right on cue? My phone calendar was just one form of tracking, but soon I'd start noticing more than just the timing. Little physical details would catch my eye that suggested this wasn't coincidence at all. And that's when I also couldn't ignore the other constant. Because every time Dana's car failed, one person arrived almost instantly like he'd been waiting for the signal. Thomas, the tow truck superhero. Thomas turned these moments into something more than simple repairs. He arrived with such predictable speed and precision that it felt rehearsed, as if he were a performer stepping onto stage right on cue. Dana's car would fail, and minutes later he was standing there already dressed for the role. Gloves on, headlights strapped, rag tucked into his back pocket. He didn't look like a guy responding to an emergency, but more like someone waiting behind the curtain, ready to make his entrance. The way he handled each scene wasn't just about fixing a car. He narrated the moment. He'd say things like catastrophic failure or total collapse in a tone that made the problem sound apocalyptic. Nothing about his choice of words was casual. He leaned under the hood, took deep, theatrical breaths, and rattled off phrases as if he were reading lines from a script. My eyes would shift between him and Dana, and it stung seeing how captivated she looked by this exaggerated performance. Then there were the tools. Every time he arrived, he had whatever exact part or tool the problem supposedly required. If the alternator was out, he already had one. If the brakes were soft, he was squeezing the right hydraulic lines before I could even ask questions. It didn't add up. Nobody carries a traveling auto parts store in their truck unless they already know what to expect. For me, the way he appeared equipped was the biggest tell that this wasn't luck. It was theater disguised as preparation. That performance left me standing off to the side, useless. If I even reached toward the car, Thomas would block me verbally, saying, "Don't worry, man, I got it." And then he went right back to his spotlight act. He would tighten bolts with extra strain, wipe sweat across his forehead in slow motion, and slam the hood down with the seriousness of a surgeon finishing an operation. Each exit was punctuated by the slam of toolboxes and the roar of his truck, as if he wanted the whole block to hear his act of heroics. Dana treated him like the savior he clearly wanted to be. She smiled, thanked him, and praised his dependability. To her, it was relief. To me, it was a sideshow I couldn't opt out of. The more these rescues stacked up, the more I felt reduced to little more than background. Just another extra in a performance that starred Thomas and his carefully staged rescues. Every gesture from him and every look from her underscored that I wasn't needed. And I wasn't the only one who noticed how overblown it all felt. His girlfriend, Brenda, eventually began expressing concerns about his constant disappearances. I didn't know her well, but I heard through mutual friends that she confronted him over spending more time playing hero with Dana than being present in his own relationship. That detail made me realize this wasn't just a triangle where I was pushed aside. It was bigger, creating friction somewhere else too. And it raised an even sharper question. If even his girlfriend saw the act for what it was, why was Dana still blind to it? Still, trying to laugh it off was sometimes my only tool for dealing with the absurdity. I catch myself imagining Thomas in some ridiculous comic book costume, cape trailing behind him, sockets glowing like gadgets, booming out "Never Fear" while grease smeared across his cheek like warrior paint. Those mental pictures gave me a bit of humor, but even my imagination couldn't keep up with how close his real behavior already was to parody. He wasn't a mechanic showing up out of generosity. He was acting out a superhero fantasy, and Dana was his audience of one. The harder reality was that each detail accumulated into something that didn't sit right. The scripted words, the perfect timing, the rehearsed gestures, and now the knowledge that even Brenda saw a problem. Taken together, it started looking less like random good fortune and more like a system he controlled from behind the curtain. I felt jammed between suspicion and proof, caught in a play where the story hadn't revealed its ending yet. That itch for clarity only grew sharper the longer it went on. His rescues stopped surprising me. Instead, they set me on edge. Every time Dana's car so much as rattled, I knew I'd soon see Thomas playing out his well-rehearsed drama yet again. I couldn't turn off the thought that there had to be something deliberate about his precision, theatrical habits that no normal mechanic would ever feel the need to perform. I needed some way to untangle my suspicions from what might just be jealousy. I needed a record, some way to test whether I was inventing things in my head or whether Thomas's rescues were actually orchestrated. Watching his act and swallowing my frustration wasn't enough anymore. So I decided on something simple, something only I would see, at least at first. I started documenting. Nothing complicated, just a cheap spiral notebook I kept in my bag. Dates, times, when part failed, how fast Thomas arrived, and the exact way he carried himself each time. At first, it was supposed to be proof for myself, validation that I wasn't imagining the rhythm. But those pages quickly grew into something more, taking on the look of an investigation. And once I started, I couldn't stop. The boyfriend's detective notebook. I didn't wake up one morning deciding to play detective, but the idea settled, then almost on its own. After watching the cycle repeat more times than I could ignore, I grabbed an old spiral notebook from the drawer and started treating it as my case file. It wasn't fancy, just a couple bent pages left over from college notes, but once I wrote Incident 1 across the top, I couldn't stop. Each breakdown earned its own entry, date, time, exact location, and how long it took before Thomas appeared. I wasn't jotting guesses, I was building a record, one neat line at a time. The entries started plain enough. Friday, 2:05 p.m., Dana's battery dead. Thomas arrives 3 minutes later. Then came another Friday, 1:58 p.m., brakes acting up. Thomas on scene before roadside service even picked up. The quickness of his arrivals kept jumping off the page. With every new note, I could see the pattern layering itself into black and white proof, something harder to dismiss than a nagging gut feeling. Of course, I couldn't resist adding a little flair. A couple of pages in, the notebook wasn't just bullet points anymore. It had doodles spreading into the margins. One page held a rough sketch of Thomas's tow truck with the caption, Base of Operations. Another page had him drawn in a cape, holding a wrench like a sword. My handwriting wasn't great, but the humor kept me steady. On one quiet night, I gave a full page to Operation Engine Timer scrawled in thick ink with arrows pointing to imaginary countdowns. Even though I knew that part was just me venting, the notebook still showed what mattered most, his uncanny timing. Sometimes I'd spread the pages across the dining table, flipping between entries like I was piecing together a crime novel. While Dana brushed it off and called it my weird little project, I took the notebook seriously. Every line was a marker, proof that the breakdowns weren't random streaks of bad luck. The consistency jumped out without needing colored string or thumbtacks. The data had its own rhythm, and I felt it pressing closer to one conclusion. Thomas had knowledge no one else did. Carrying the notebook with me turned into habit, like carrying a wallet. If Dana texted suddenly about car trouble, I didn't just react. I reached for the spiral first. Even at work, I'd flip it open and add quick details the second she called. I didn't tell anyone what I was tracking. I didn't need side eyes or explanations about why I had pages full of times and locations that made it look like I was shadowing a sitcom character instead of living a relationship. The funny thing was how the notebook shaped my focus. While Dana's words were about inconvenience, canceled plans, waiting around, or having to reschedule her day, I absorbed events as evidence. Each time she sighed in the passenger seat about another wasted afternoon, I was busy noting the exact intersection, cross street, and minute Thomas rolled up. Where she saw inconvenience, I saw patterns. Where she saw someone saving her, I saw timing too perfect to ignore. Even the humor in my scribbles echoed what bothered me most. The cape sketches, or hero pose predictions, weren't wild theories. They were shorthand reminders, making me smile long enough to mask annoyance. But they always circled back to the same line of evidence. The breakdowns happened on schedule, and Thomas arrived prepared. That wasn't me imagining elaborate devices or Bond-level sabotage. That was me cataloging dates and noticing how the dots kept connecting only to him. Looking at it now, the notebook was both funny and serious. Funny in how it resembled a comic book script at times, with goofy sketches poking fun at Thomas's flair. Serious, because for the first time, I had a record I could point to instead of just my voice. When I flipped through it from start to finish, it felt undeniable. The numbers spoke clearly. It wasn't paranoia if the pattern stared back at me in ink. But pages and dates only took me so far. The notebook pinned down the rhythm, yes, but it was still just theory written on paper. What I needed next was something physical, something I could see, touch, or point at beyond the spiral. Because no matter how neat the dates were lined up, Dana didn't feel the weight of them. She shrugged off my suspicions even with the notebook sitting between us. And that's when the story tipped forward. All the notes, all the scratches in the margins, every Cape Doodle and sarcastic label, they built enough resolve in me to start paying close attention beyond the page. That's what pushed me towards spotting the first tangible clue, the moment where suspicion shifted into evidence. What struck me most, though, was how Dana remained oblivious through all of this. While I logged patterns and timing in my so-called case file, she floated along in a completely different story. And it wasn't mine. For every date I circled and every second I measured, she reacted like she was stepping into a romantic comedy instead of a repeating trap. Girlfriend's blissful oblivion. Dana, on the other hand, never seemed to notice a thing. Every time the hood popped open and Thomas slid in to save the day, her whole face softened into gratitude, like watching a scene play out the way it was supposed to. It didn't matter if it was the third breakdown that month, she treated each one like a fresh rescue, thanking him over and over as if he were doing the impossible. What I saw as constant interference, she received as a kind of gift. One night, when the car died again and Thomas rolled up faster than roadside assistance ever could, Dana actually called him her guardian angel. She said it in this light, joking voice, but the way she looked at him afterwards gave it weight. I made a joke under my breath, something bitter, something about demons and wrenches, but it slid right past her. What stuck with her was the nickname, and she repeated it later at dinner, proud of how perfectly it fit. I can still remember sitting across from her, smiling politely while my insides twisted up, because I'd been the one she leaned on before. Now, that role was clearly shifting. The gratitude never paused, no matter how disruptive the timing got. Once her brakes failed, just as she needed to leave for an important family dinner, and Thomas jumped in without hesitation. She was so relieved she texted me later about how amazing it was that he knew just what to do right when she needed it most. Another time, her car wouldn't start in a parking lot when she had to get to work, and Thomas rescued her before she even had the chance to call me. She was thankful, glowing about how dependable he was, while my offers to step in barely registered. It was that shift, the quiet but constant redirection toward him, that hit hardest. She used to call me first, even for simple inconveniences, like when she locked her keys inside the house or needed advice about where to take her car. But lately, she didn't. She reached out to Thomas, smiled at Thomas, praised Thomas. The more she leaned into his help, the less she seemed to notice mine. I didn't need to hear her say it outright. The steady beam in her eyes whenever she looked at him during a breakdown told me all I needed to know. In her story, Thomas was the one positioned at the center while I stuck to the edges. When I tried voicing my concern, she waved it aside as if I were imagining problems that weren't there. Thomas is just always around, she said once, shrugging like it was some fixed law of nature. She wasn't dismissive out of malice. She genuinely didn't see anything strange about the pattern. To her, a friend being that available was lucky, not suspicious. My words, my notes, my unease, all of it sounded petty stacked against her steady gratitude. Watching her choose to trust in him so fully made my doubts sound smaller every time I spoke them out loud. And that silence from her end, her gentle brush off, hurt more than I wanted to admit. I often caught myself studying her more than the repairs. The way she sighed with relief when Thomas tightened the last bolt, or how she'd lean against the car sipping coffee while he worked, completely calm and confident. It was ordinary for her. The steadiness of her gratitude had its own logic, and I started to resent how cleanly it erased my suspicions. I could mutter under my breath, scribble in my notebook, connect the dots until midnight, but none of it weighed as much to Dana as a single reassuring smile from Thomas. The maddening part was how much sense it seemed to make from her perspective. Breakdowns are stressful, and someone who always fixes them for free has obvious value. She had no reason to dig deeper. In her story, she had a trusted friend who swooped in whenever needed, and that was the end of it. But watching it happen through my eyes made the whole thing unbearable. I could feel myself fading into the background while she poured trust into him. Gratitude built a wall I couldn't climb, no matter how many suspicions or notes I threw at it. That split between our views felt like living in separate realities. To her, the plot was simple. She had someone dependable she could count on, someone she even teased about being her guardian angel. To me, each breakdown was a staged scene building towards something larger. I couldn't shake the sense that his rehearsed timing and free repairs weren't acts of kindness. They were part of the trick. And no matter how many times I tried to explain, I sounded jealous, petty, or over-analytical. That, more than anything, deepened the distance between us. It finally hit me during one of those late-night rescues when she said, "I don't know what I'd do without him." She said it casually, almost as an afterthought, but it landed heavier than anything else. Because I remembered when she used to say things like that about me, when I was the person she called first, the one she leaned on without thinking. Now, every time her car stalled, she didn't even dial my number. She expected him. And that unshakable certainty she had around Thomas only sharpened the frustration I carried in silence. Looking back, her oblivion is what made the whole setup sting so sharply. If she had seen through the surface even once, if she had questioned his timing or raised the same doubts I held, it might have closed the gap I felt tearing open between us. But her steady gratitude kept the illusion alive. Every smile she sent his way was another reminder that my warnings weren't breaking through. And as much as I hated it, I couldn't deny that her certainty made me look wild in comparison. I didn't stop observing, though, and I didn't stop recording. If anything, her unwavering faith pushed me further into watching carefully, because while she believed she was witnessing simple kindness, I believed I was watching something staged. And the longer it went on, the clearer it became that Thomas wasn't just repairing cars, he was putting on a show. That realization is what stuck with me most. It wasn't just about the bolts or the smoke under the hood anymore. His rescues had an audience, and in every scene, Dana was caught up in his performance. What I noticed next shifted everything, making it impossible to pretend these were simple fixes. The theater of repairs. The first glimpse of what I'd later call the theater of repairs happened right in Dana's driveway. Thomas had the hood lifted, and instead of bending down quietly to actually handle the problem, he let out these deep, dramatic sighs that seemed rehearsed. They weren't ordinary mechanic noises. They were staged, the kind of sighs you'd expect from an actor playing a weary hero. Then came the voice, heavy, deliberate, laced with ominous phrasing about catastrophic failure and seconds away from disaster. Dana leaned on the fender, wide-eyed, taking in every exaggerated word like they were gospel, while I stood a few steps back, thinking it was just a blown fuse. What should have been a 5-minute diagnosis turned into a full script. Thomas narrating as though he wasn't tightening bolts, but fighting off the apocalypse with a wrench. From that moment on, I noticed the motif repeating itself with every so-called emergency. His two trademark moves became easy to spot, almost like catchphrases in a sitcom. First came the long, world-weary sigh, a vocal cue that danger had barely been avoided. He squeezed it into every scene, whether it was a squeaky belt or a nearly flat tire. Then came the reveal, pulling some harmless part from under the hood with grave ceremony. It could be a bolt, a smudged filter, a piece of tubing, but the way he raised it up like sacred evidence, you'd swear he had yanked out the car's beating heart. Each time, Dana gasped on cue, staring at the object in his greasy hands like he had just discovered the one thing standing between her and a fiery highway death. Watching it roll out again and again, I realized these weren't habits, they were props. The sigh, the held-up part, the speech about unseen dangers, they kept the audience, Dana, hooked every single time. And that was the real performance. She didn't just drive away believing the car was fixed. She drove away believing she had narrowly survived something. The fact Thomas repeated the same moves each time only seemed to make them land harder with her. I started to think of them as his stage cues, the signals he always hit before the curtain could fall. What unsettled me more was when I caught him continuing the act even after Dana left the scene. One particular evening stands out. Dana had gone back inside, thanking him yet again for saving her from what he had called a certain blowout waiting to happen. But I hung back on the porch. After she disappeared inside, I saw Thomas quietly raise the car again on the jack and crawl underneath. No audience this time, no dramatic sighs, no show. Just quiet tinkering he hadn't bothered to attempt when she was standing there. That was the moment that clicked something deeper for me. The routine wasn't about repairs at all when she was present. The real adjustments, whatever they were, happened afterwards, when he wasn't performing. The thought gnawed at me. Was he fixing what he'd staged earlier? Creating the next emergency? Or just cleaning up the mess left from the scene he'd acted out? I couldn't tell, but the separation between showtime and the hidden second act told me one thing clearly. His behavior wasn't about efficient maintenance. It was about keeping Dana convinced. The car problems weren't random inconveniences. They had a rhythm, a storyline, and he was the writer, director, and star. The longer it went on, the harder it became for me to even take the repairs seriously. Whenever Thomas crouched down and sighed into the engine bay, I heard the same cadence actors use on stage. Whenever he held up some ordinary component with that grave face, I was waiting for him to take a bow. I started picturing ridiculous images in my head. Neighbors lined up in folding chairs, popcorn in hand, watching him milk a corroded battery cable for all its dramatic worth. His toolbox wasn't equipment anymore. It was a magician's kit. Pulling out a ruined bolt became just another sleight of hand trick. Even the way he delivered explanations told me he had rehearsed them. He favored lines about responsibility or long-term safety, themes that turned ordinary fixes into moral lessons. Once, while tightening a coolant hose, he told Dana she had been a single drive away from disaster and that it was a reminder to never ignore the little things. She nodded thoughtfully, like he was imparting wisdom instead of simply connecting a clamp. His voice had this gravity that made the simplest repairs sound like turning points. And for her, that meant leaving the driveway not only relieved, but oddly uplifted. Meanwhile, I noticed my notebook entries growing shorter. Instead of cataloging every sigh, I just started drawing little arrows when he repeated the signature moves, exaggerated sigh here, triumphant part reveal there. The pattern was too obvious to keep writing long notes. It was eerie how consistently he landed the same beats. If someone had pieced together recordings of his repairs, they would have looked scripted, like a rerun always playing out the same way. My biggest frustration was knowing Dana didn't see any of the artifice. While I saw grease smeared across his cheek as deliberate stage makeup, she saw it as proof of effort. While I recognized him shaking his head over a part that wasn't even broken, she thought it meant he had spared her some enormous expense. She bought every sigh, every warning, every staged prop, because she wanted to believe it. And the more she believed, the smaller my counterpoints became. If I called it a performance, I sounded bitter. If I laughed, I sounded insensitive. At some point, I stopped trying to debunk his theater in front of her. She wasn't coming to the scene to learn about cars, she was showing up for comfort. What fueled Thomas's role was exactly that, comfort packaged as sacrifice. He looked weary, he sounded noble, he sacrificed time and energy in her eyes, and in return, she felt looked after. No amount of explaining how unnecessary the size or props were could change that perception. What I couldn't shake was how often his productions coincided so neatly with her schedule. They weren't random street corner rescues. They happened right when she had other plans, when we had something lined up together, when her attention would otherwise be elsewhere. By then, I was starting to realize the real effect of these plays wasn't just about keeping her dependence on him alive. It was quietly rewriting how her time unfolded too. The more I thought about that, the more suspicious the timing became. These dramatic repairs didn't just take up her afternoons. They started reshaping entire evenings. The car stopped being just a car. It became this fragile prop in his performance, always ready to steal her focus the moment something important for us came up. And that's when I started watching our own plans unravel in ways that felt anything but accidental. The missed date mystery. It didn't start with some grand revelation. It began with one date here, another there, plans that fell apart under the same excuse of car trouble. At first, I didn't overthink it. People miss things sometimes. Cars give out, repairs take time. But then it kept happening, and not in random ways. The breakdowns showed up with surgical timing, landing squarely on nights that actually mattered. Slowly, a pattern pressed itself into place. Every time Dana and I had something big lined up, her car found a way to collapse, and Thomas was already there to take over. The first time it truly cut deep was the concert. Dana had begged me for weeks to get tickets, her favorite band coming through town. I managed to snag a pair, and she was genuinely excited, sending me links to the set list, planning her outfit, building it up like it would be the highlight of the month. But on the afternoon of the show, she messaged, "Car died in the lot. Thomas is on it." I told her we still had hours, that she could make it, but she never came. Instead, Dana spent the evening in a shop while I sat in my apartment, 2 unused tickets staring back at me. I tried to tell myself it was just bad luck, that cars don't care about live shows, but the sting of sitting home alone while she was at his garage made that excuse feel paper thin. A few weeks later, another blow landed, this time with higher stakes. We planned to attend her cousin's wedding. She had her dress ready. I bought a suit. We picked out a thoughtful gift. The morning before, everything seemed fine. By afternoon, she called with panic in her voice. Her brakes had failed. But by that evening, Thomas already had them fixed. Strangely, though, the repair didn't restore our plan. Dana said she didn't feel comfortable risking a long drive right after another breakdown. So I went alone, sitting through a family celebration with an empty seat beside me, listening to small talk about why my girlfriend couldn't make it. If you've ever navigated a reception solo while your chair gets pity glances, you'll know how humiliating it feels. By then, I was done chalking it up to coincidence. 2 important events wrecked by car problems and conveniently patched up by Thomas too late to matter. That wasn't chance. It was precision. The soccer practice schedule of breakdowns I've logged in my notebook now bled into our social life, sabotaging things we'd anticipated for weeks. And right when I thought it couldn't get more personal, the anniversary disaster proved me wrong. That night was supposed to matter most. I booked a small table by a window at her favorite restaurant, tucked a small gift into my jacket pocket, and actually felt proud of the effort. But at 4 p.m., my phone buzzed with a message I'd come to dread. "Car trouble again. Thomas is here." I read it twice before realizing what it meant. The dinner we'd planned for weeks evaporated in one sentence. She later explained it was her muffler this time, laughing that Thomas said it had a panic attack, and could have rattled itself loose on the road. Meanwhile, I sat staring at a reservation that turned useless in a gift that no one opened. That empty chair across from me at the restaurant was a sharper insult than the wedding, because it wasn't just family this time. It was just supposed to be us. It was hard not to notice the rhythm behind all this. The emergencies never came on slow weeks or quiet nights. They flared up right before things that counted, the events placed on calendars in bold. That wasn't speculation, it was the pattern I had written down in black ink. Concert, wedding, anniversary. Always the important moments. Always cut short the same way. What Dana brushed off as coincidence, I couldn't see as anything but deliberate interference. The hardest part wasn't the cancellations themselves. It was watching Dana accept each one without suspicion. She apologized each time, yes, sincerely, even sweetly, but her words carried no recognition that the timing mattered. To her, a car problem was just a problem, and Thomas swooping in was further proof of how fortunate she was to have such a reliable friend. She even repeated that phrase guardian angel as if these breakdowns were blessings in disguise. I kept my replies measured, but inside it made me ache. Because where she saw rescue, I saw the string of events that drew her further from me every time. After a while, I hesitated even making plans with her. Looking at dinner menus or scrolling through local events didn't spark excitement anymore. It made me predict which part of her car would collapse next. Too many nights had ended in the same city. Dana stranded, Thomas already present, me left with an unused ticket or an untouched reservation. To test my gut, I even tried an experiment. Small outings, no details revealed, nothing officially scheduled. Those nights usually went fine. But the moment plans were locked in, tickets on hand, reservations guaranteed, a new failure appeared. The brakes soft, the battery suspiciously low, the muffler shaken. Each one cut through the calendar with the same efficiency. By then, it no longer felt like an accident. I couldn't laugh it off, and I couldn't ignore the evidence in front of me. On the surface, it was just missed events, simple cancellations. But living through them, I felt the weight of something more calculated. Every plan that crumbled meant Thomas gained another long evening with Dana, while I sat alone refining theories in my notebook. Each letdown carried the same conclusion. The timing was engineered, and I was the one left outside, trying to piece together invisible hands pulling the strings. Looking back, I can admit part of me spiraled. I wrote lines in my notebook that sound absurd now. Questions wondering if her Corolla had a vengeful streak, if metal and wiring could know what nights mattered most. But even while I laughed at myself, the one thing I couldn't dismiss was the data. And in that data, the rhythm was undeniable. You didn't need wild theories when the events lined up as cleanly as they did. Through it all, the common denominator never wavered. Every ruined night turned into more fuel for Thomas's role as the dependable savior. I was left with excuses and empty chairs. He left with gratitude and her trust. That imbalance ate at me until I stopped pretending I could rationalize it anymore. And yet, for all my notes and suspicions, I still lacked something concrete. I needed more than canceled dinners and marked up calendars. I needed evidence that lived beyond my head or my notebook. As much as I hated every missed night, what followed them showed me the first real sign that my suspicions weren't just paranoia. Because soon, I wouldn't be dealing with vague theories anymore. I'd stumbled across a clue that shifted everything. The boyfriend's first clue. It wasn't a dramatic discovery with flashing lights or a big aha moment. It was just a quiet Saturday morning, walking past Dana's car after Thomas had left the night before. Normally, I avoided touching anything under that hood. I knew if she caught me poking around, I'd look paranoid, but something odd caught my attention. One of the bolts on the battery didn't look right. It sat at an angle, crooked, almost like it was barely holding on. I leaned in closer, slid my fingers across it, and twisted. To my surprise, it turned easily, no tools needed. A mechanic doesn't forget something that basic. And Thomas, of all people, the guy who turned every repair into a stage performance, wouldn't have overlooked a bolt like that by accident. That was the first moment when suspicion turned into something solid. I knelt down for a better look, scanning the rest of the engine bay, and spotted another detail that made my stomach knot. The alternator bracket wasn't snug, just slightly loose, as someone had backed it off on purpose, not by mistake. My thoughts immediately started racing. Could this be it? The thing I've been waiting for? A sign that these breakdowns weren't fate, but manipulation? I ducked back inside, grabbed the small flashlight I owned, and returned like I was about to confirm a crime scene. I wasn't pretending anymore, wasn't doodling spy gadgets or stretching coincidences. I was checking for something real. That's when I spotted the battery terminals. I expected them to be clean, especially after one of Thomas's dramatic saves. Instead, a light crust had already built up across them. Corrosion doesn't spread like that overnight. It certainly doesn't appear fresh and smeared in irregular patches, as if painted on for affect. It looks unnatural, almost staged, marks of sabotage designed to mimic neglect. Standing there in the driveway with my flashlight beam catching crystals of corrosion that shouldn't have been there, I suddenly felt like the evidence wasn't hypothetical anymore. For the first time, I wasn't just logging dates and guessing motives. I was staring at physical traces left behind. Loose bolts, loose brackets, and corrosion that couldn't be explained by chance. It was all right in front of me. My neighbor strolled by with his dog, gave me a glance, and probably assumed I was just fumbling through amateur car maintenance. But what I saw was confirmation. Thomas wasn't just conveniently present at disasters. He was planting the seeds. The pattern of his behavior suddenly snapped into sharper focus. The theatrics, the constant talk about imminent collapse, the routine warnings, they didn't just dramatize real problems. Now I realized much of it could have been built on mistakes he arranged himself. There were oil streaks across the side panel too, broad and smeared in places oil would never travel naturally. They looked painted on, almost the way an actor dabs makeup to make a bruise more convincing. He wasn't only fixing issues, he was crafting them, then leaving visible evidence so Dana would be grateful and reliant. I went inside, opened my notebook, and for the first time my filled pages felt more weighty than theoretical. I didn't scribble jokes or doodle timers. I wrote concrete notes. Battery bolt obviously loosened. Alternator bracket loose. Fresh corrosion. likely applied. Underlining each phrase dug into the paper, leaving grooves through the page beneath. This wasn't guesswork any longer. For months, I had been logging times and dates like a man losing his grip. But now I had entries about actual nuts, bolts, and residue that anyone could inspect with their own hands. For the first time since this started, I didn't feel crazy. It was an odd kind of relief, standing in the driveway, greasy fingers, notebook in hand, realizing my paranoia had roots. The weight lifted, not because the problem was solved, but because now I could see proof that fit everything else I'd noticed. Every canceled concert, every vanished night out, every guardian angel rescue, it all traced back to these tiny manipulations under the hood. A bolt here, a bracket there, a splash of fake corrosion. The scale of it both amazed and sickened me. The temptation to march straight to Dana with my findings was strong. I imagined pointing out the bolt, showing her how it turned loose without even a wrench. I imagined her astonishment, her sudden clarity as she realized Thomas was no saint. But then I pictured her brushing it off with a shrug, or maybe even laughing. To her, Thomas was dependable, selfless, trustworthy. She wouldn't believe he had planted the very failures he swooped in to fix. She'd think I was grasping at scraps of metal to justify jealousy. That fear of dismissal sat heavier than any satisfaction the discovery gave me. So I kept quiet. I logged each clue carefully, but I didn't tell her. Not yet. My evidence felt strong, but not strong enough to shatter her certainty. She'd need something undeniable, something that went beyond a boyfriend's word and into the realm of being caught red-handed. I knew what it meant. My role had shifted again. I wasn't just the guy with a notebook. I was the one silently gathering the case until it became too heavy for anyone to ignore. And as much as it steadied me to have real proof now tucked away in my notes, it also pushed me forward. Loose bolts and stage corrosion weren't the end, they were the beginning. If Thomas could leave marks this obvious, then the deeper act was still waiting. More evidence would show itself if I paid closer attention. That Saturday morning was the first time my suspicions moved from paper into the physical world. From then on, I couldn't help but wonder what else went unseen when his rescue show ended and everyone stepped back inside. What exactly did he do once the lights of his performance went dark? That question hung in my mind, and it was clear the only way to answer it was to watch for myself. The stakeout operation. I knew the loose bolts and corrosion marks I'd already found weren't enough. Paper entries in a pie notebook could make me sound obsessive, not convincing. What I needed was to actually witness if the way Thomas handled the car when no one was watching. That was the only way I could turn suspicion into something undeniable. So the next time he picked up Dana's car for one of his sudden, urgent checks, I tailed him in my own car. I kept far enough behind to avoid headlights catching his mirrors, but close enough that my chest nodded every time he braked. My plan was simple. Stay parked within sight and note everything. If he was really engineering these breakdowns, he'd slip once the audience cleared. He finally stopped at Dana's apartment complex, pulling into her driveway the same way he always did. I rolled into a spot down the street, close enough to see, angled just enough to look casual if anyone happened past. My notebook waited on the passenger seat, pen in my hand. Half the nerves running through me came from the fear of being caught, but the other half was sharper, anticipation. I needed to see what I already suspected. From my position, I had a clean view of the stage he always set. Hood up, toolbox open, exaggerated movements designed to reassure Dana. His voice carried even half a block down, elevated and dramatic, telling her how close she'd been to serious damage and how fortunate it was that he caught it in time. She nodded along, grateful, the same script I'd seen dozens of times before. I scrawled a timestamp in the margin. Initial rescue scene ends, but then something new unfolded. When Dana finally smiled thanks and walked back inside, Thomas didn't pack his tools. He didn't close the hood or signal that the job was finished. Instead, he glanced around, one long look side to side, as if making sure no one was left to watch. And then he bent over the engine again, this time without a word. His movements changed. The dramatic flourishes stopped. What I saw now was quiet, exact, the way you'd expect from someone not fixing a problem but setting one up. I leaned forward and nearly pressing against the steering wheel watching his hand shift steadily between parts. He held his wrench against something below the alternator, twisting with deliberate care, then paused to wiggle a cable. A few seconds later, he moved to another part and adjusted again, not tightening, not securing, more like loosening. The rhythm was slow but purposeful, and each second I watched felt heavier than the last. My hand cramped as I scribbled notes faster than I could process. Brackets? Tampering motion? Waited until alone. None of it was subtle. He wasn't inspecting. He was selecting. You could almost see the calculation in his pauses. He worked in short bursts, then leaned back slightly, scanned the area again, then dipped low under the hood once more. By then, every quiet suspicion I'd wrestled with was solidifying into something undeniable. After nearly 10 minutes of this silent fiddling, he stopped. He didn't call out for Dana. He didn't give one of his exaggerated sighs. Instead, he straightened, smoothed his gloves, and lingered in front of the engine bay with a faint look of satisfaction, like someone who had laid out the next beat of a story exactly as rehearsed. I froze, watching as he nodded once at the car, small but unmistakably pleased, and only then began packing tools. In that moment, the puzzle pieces locked. The breakdowns hadn't been bad luck. They hadn't even been poorly finished repairs. They were deliberately planted setbacks. He staged the chaos, scripted an emergency, and left just enough loose ends to guarantee another crisis down the line. Every canceled date, every missed night had been written into the story by that nod. Right there, I had seen the con. Even as the street stayed quiet around me, the weight of it hit heavy. I wasn't paranoid imagining dates on the calendar. I hadn't misread bolts and corrosion. Now, I had watched him tamper with the car while Dana was safely inside. No audience left. No reason to be touching anything unless it was deliberate sabotage. It didn't matter if I couldn't name the exact part from across the curve. The intent was clear. Later, back in my apartment, the details spilled from me faster than I could write. Sketches, arrows, jagged handwriting sprawled across the page, adjusted after audience gone. Pulled cable deliberately. Satisfied nod equals confirmation. For months, I had been building a case from inferences. Tonight, I had evidence I had seen with my own eyes. Sitting there with the notebook full of fresh notes, I realized this was no longer theory layered on suspicion. I had caught the moment that proved it. Thomas wasn't coincidentally present or simply overdramatic. He was breaking her car so that he could fix it again 2 weeks later. That was the cycle, and I had finally seen the hidden act behind the performance. For me, that night became the smoking gun. Every scribble in my notebook, every marked date, every missed dinner flowed into that single observation: sabotage in progress. And with that clarity came a new problem: how to share what I had seen without sounding like I had lost my mind. That was the part I turned over in my head as I set the notebook aside. If Dana wouldn't believe subtle patterns of time, would she believe the word of her boyfriend who sat in the dark, watching? I didn't know. But what I did know was that keeping silent wasn't going to work anymore. The proof was too strong to bury in a notebook. I needed to find a way to tell her, not with cautionary hints or half-formed worries. I had to try to explain, carefully, exactly what I saw. And that thought settled heavier than anything else. The next step wasn't watching him. It was finally saying something to her. Confrontation that backfires. I chose a night when the timing felt right. Dinner was finished, the house was quiet, and I thought maybe Dana would be open to hearing me out. I didn't pull out the notebook or spread diagrams across the table. I kept it simple: calm voice, steady words. I suggested that maybe, just once, she take her car to a neutral mechanic, a shop that would give her paperwork, or a dealership where she'd get a clear record of what was wrong instead of another round of free fixes. I framed it as a second opinion. Nothing permanent, nothing dramatic. The suggestion dropped between us like a stone. She didn't see it as concern. She saw it as criticism. Her face hardened almost instantly. She leaned back in her chair and her voice came sharp, as if I'd said something personal about her instead of her car. To her, Thomas wasn't just a mechanic doing favors. He was the guy saving her money month after month. She accused me of being ungrateful, of ignoring the hundreds, maybe thousands that she said he was sparing her. To her, Thomas was reliable. To her, my suggestion didn't sound cautious. It sounded like disloyalty. I tried not to raise my voice. I explained it wasn't about cost or even about whether Thomas had good intentions. It was about the constant breakdowns, the fact that the timing of them lined up so predictably with our plans, the sense that something deeper was off. I told her that even if nothing sinister was happening, another opinion could take away doubt. But she cut me off mid-sentence, saying I was unfairly accusing someone who'd been nothing but generous. She defended him like she was presenting evidence at trial, how he showed up instantly every time, how he once drove across town on his day off, how he'd been taking care of her even before I was in the picture. What stunned me wasn't just what she said, but how firmly she believed it. I thought gentle logic might make her pause. Instead, the more careful I tried to be, the more entrenched she became. Any suggestion that Thomas's timing might not be innocent didn't translate as concern. It translated as an attack on her own judgment. She told me flatly she trusted him, reminded me of all the money he'd saved her, then tossed in something that caught me off guard. Even Brenda gave him grief about how much time he spends helping people. It's not just you. That hit differently. I knew Brenda was his girlfriend, but hearing Dana mention that even she had raised concerns made the whole conversation tilt. Dana framed it as proof of how stretched thin Thomas was, how much he gave of himself. To her, even Brenda's frustration worked as another badge of his selflessness. Listening to it, I realized just how far gone the defense had gone. If even another girlfriend could be turned into supporting evidence, where was my argument supposed to land? I pressed once more, asking if she didn't find it strange that he always appeared before roadside assistance could, as if he just happened to be closest every single time. She snapped that maybe he just cared more than I gave him credit for. When I replied that care can sometimes come with strings attached, that someone can want attention just as much as they want to help, she rolled her eyes so sharply I knew the wall had gone up before she even spoke. She accused me of being insecure, jealous, unwilling to accept simple kindness. She told me I was looking for flaws in a person who had done nothing but help her. The argument slid from uncomfortable into heated before I even realized it. She raised her voice. She said she was tired of me finding ways to criticize the one person who had been there for her without fail. She pointed at me and said that instead of gratitude, I was inventing shadows where none existed. Listening to her, I felt like the ground shifted under me. What I thought would be a gentle warning had turned into a battle line I hadn't meant to draw. I sat there, hands flat against the table, trying to steady myself while she explained how Thomas had earned his place in her life, while every sentence on her side seemed to make me smaller. It wasn't just defending him, it was redefining me. I had walked into that moment convinced I was presenting logic. I ended up cast as jealous and paranoid. When she finally said she didn't want to talk about it anymore and pushed her chair back, the sound of it scraping across the floor cut harder than anything in the argument. She disappeared down the hall, and I was left staring at the plate in front of me that had gone cold without either of us touching it. The room felt muted after she left. I kept replaying it all. How quickly things had gone downhill, how the idea of just checking with another mechanic had sparked such a sharp defense. I hadn't entered the conversation expecting her to embrace my suspicions right away, but I also hadn't expected her to go to battle for him with such certainty. It left me sitting alone with the realization that I had lost the exchange before it had even begun. The irony cut deep. I wanted to peel back Thomas's act, to reveal that his endless fixes weren't just favors, but the only thing I managed was to drive Dana tighter into his corner. I'd meant to protect. Instead, I looked like the problem. And in the space between her defense of him and her frustration with me, I saw the design of it all with new clarity. His game wasn't just about corrosion and bolts. It was about trust. He had managed to stack himself up as dependable while pressing me down into doubt. For the first time, I wasn't just frustrated. I was defeated. The confrontation hadn't built a bridge. It had burned one. The man I believed was sabotaging her car had managed somehow to sabotage the conversation too. And sitting there in the silence he'd left behind, I felt the weight of the trap settle in. What haunted me most afterward was the sense that Thomas's plan worked even when I thought I was outside of it. His performances under the hood weren't just designed for her audience. They shaped how she saw me when I questioned them. I didn't come out as cautious or protective. I came out as suspicious and petty. And he came out shining, again, as the one man she could rely on. I didn't scribble any notes that night. The notebook stayed on the counter, untouched. Because notes didn't matter when the person you wanted to protect refused to hear them. I sat there instead, knowing that my warnings had just pushed her further away and that logic had failed to shift her trust. And that silence, thick and heavy, left me with one unavoidable thought. Maybe I already had every piece of this puzzle sitting in front of me. I just hadn't put them together yet. The big reveal. The moment of clarity didn't hit in a single flash. It was more like watching months of scattered notes finally snap into one complete picture. The dates and patterns in my notebook, the sabotage I'd found under the hood, the stakeout where I saw him tampering after Dana went inside, all of it pointed in the same direction. Every 2 weeks, right on schedule, her car broke just enough to need saving. Every fix was staged. Every dramatic sigh and triumphant reveal was just theater. And the repairs never lasted long enough to end the cycle because Thomas never intended to end it. It was undeniable now. He built dependence. He made himself necessary by creating problems only he could solve. He loosened bolts, smeared fake corrosion, and left Dana stranded on cue so he could swoop in looking like a hero. He wasn't unlucky. He wasn't overly generous. He was orchestrating breakdowns to make sure she never went too long without calling him. When you lined up the evidence, the perfect schedule, the notebook full of timestamps, the loose battery bolt, and the stakeout where I saw his satisfied nod, it told one clear story. Thomas engineered his role in her life by breaking her car on purpose. For a long moment, the weight of it all settled in. What I had brushed off as paranoia was never paranoia. The facts were plain. Every empty chair on nights we'd planned, every canceled event, every line Dana repeated about him being her guardian angel, all of it had been manufactured. He used her car as the anchor tying her to him, building a cycle where she always needed rescuing and he always answered. Once I accepted it, I couldn't shake how absurd it was. The simplicity of his scheme almost made it feel ridiculous. He didn't need elaborate tricks or hidden devices. He just sabotaged what she relied on the most and then fixed it halfway. Sabotage, rescue, repeat. It was manipulative, but effective. He knew Dana trusted him because of their long history, and he took advantage of that trust to position himself in her daily life in ways I couldn't compete with. What made it worse was realizing it reached beyond just us. Thomas had a girlfriend of his own, Brenda, and even she started noticing how much time he spent hovering over Dana's car. I heard from a mutual friend that she confronted him about his disappearances, about how he was more invested in rescuing someone else than maintaining his own relationship. That confrontation didn't go well. Before long, Brenda was out of the picture completely, and Thomas and Dana grew closer in her absence. It all clicked into place once I saw it from that angle. He wasn't just angling to be her mechanic. He was angling for her. For Dana, none of this looked suspicious. In her mind, she had simply been lucky enough to have a friend who always showed up and refused to take her money. She felt indebted to him in the best way. And now, without Brenda in the way, she had even more reason to treat Thomas's presence in her life as natural, even comforting. Where I saw manipulation, she saw reliability. The car kept reminding her of who she could count on, and it wasn't me. Looking back at the fights we'd had, her defensiveness suddenly made perfect sense. It wasn't just that. She trusted Thomas more than she trusted my suspicions. It was that she had been living in a carefully built pattern designed to reinforce his importance. When every breakdown ends with the same savior, the idea of replacing him with a neutral mechanic sounds like betrayal. She didn't want to break the cycle because the cycle kept reminding her she was cared for. realizing that was the hardest part. No matter how detailed my notebook was, no matter how many bolts I found half-turned, Dana already believed her version of the story, and her version left no space for mine. The more evidence I gathered, the more I sounded like someone inventing reasons to distrust her closest friend. The gap between what I knew and what she believed grew too wide to cross. And that's when I understood it wasn't just Dana's car he had been dismantling. Piece by piece, he'd been dismantling my place in her life too. Every time breakdown was another stolen night. Every staged repair was another chance for gratitude to flow his way. He'd used grease and schedules to rearrange her priorities until she leaned on him instead of me. And by the time I finally connected every dot, it was already too late to pull her back from it. On paper, the truth was obvious. He wasn't fixing her car out of generosity. He was weakening it intentionally to create a cycle of crises he could solve, ensuring her reliance on him. Brenda's breakup proved he was willing to destroy his own relationship in the process, and Dana's loyalty to him showed how well his plan worked. The deception wasn't hidden anymore. It was laid bare in my notes, in the driveway, and in every canceled night we'd lived through. After that, I stopped trying to win her over. I didn't stage another confrontation or plan clever ways to present evidence. I saw enough of what was happening to realize it didn't matter. She had already chosen the story she believed. And I couldn't stay in a relationship where every important moment was bent around someone else's sabotage. The turning point wasn't anger, it was clarity. He wanted control, and she gave it to him without questioning. My role had become arguing against her trust, while Thomas's role was reinforcing it every 2 weeks. So I ended things. I broke up with Dana because no amount of proof could compete with the trust she had already placed in him. Telling her again would have only driven her closer to him, and staying meant living inside a cycle I already knew was staged. Walking away hurt, but it was the only way to stop handing over my own time, my own patience into his hands. In the end, the big reveal was simple. The car wasn't unreliable by chance. The rescues weren't heroic. The breakdowns weren't fate. They were sabotage crafted into a performance designed to keep Dana dependent and Thomas indispensable. And once you saw the whole picture, it was impossible to unsee. The thing that stuck with me after leaving wasn't even the betrayal. It was how cleanly the manipulation had hidden under the surface. Because sometimes what we call bad luck or coincidence isn't bad luck at all. It's someone quietly engineering the story you're living in. And that left me with one final lesson, one that I'd carry even after walking away. In the end, the truth was simple. It wasn't bad luck at all. The breakdowns were staged. The rescues were a performance, and the trust Dana gave him was built on sabotage. I confronted what I could, but she stood by him, and that left me with no choice but to walk away. Thomas had engineered dependence, and once I saw it clearly, the relationship couldn't survive it. So here's the takeaway. When coincidences line up too neatly, trust the pattern. If help always arrives too conveniently, verify it before you rely on it. And now I want to hear from you. What would you have done in my place? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and if you enjoy stories like this, make sure to like and subscribe for more.